Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Think BRICS. Rambling on the web, searching for an information that could be interesting and useful for our viewers, we have found an article that caught my eye. The name of the article is BRICS so attractive for China? Question mark. This research was presented on 13th annual conference on the world economy. BRICS and the rethinking of the global economic order. That was the topic. The author of this research is a young economist, scholar, Andrey Gnidchenko. Andrei graduated from Lomonosov Moscow State University in 2011. For almost 15 years, he has been working at a Russian think tank called Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting. His research focuses on international trade issues and structural change. Andrei, are you with us? Yes, you are.
Yeah, hi
Welcome to Think
Anastasia.
BRICS.
Hi to everyone.
Welcome to
I'm pleased to be here this evening.
Well, Ben, welcome to Think BRICS too. Dear viewers,
Yeah.
Ben Epstein
Hi Ben.
Thank
with
you so
us.
much for including me.
Well, Ben is stuck in the snowfall and he couldn't manage to arrive in time in his office. So Ben, but we know you are with us. Even in your car with the microphone in hand, Ben follows our discussions on economics.
Got a little pocket of Siberia out here with me. So, you got to bring the equipment and you never know when you have a great discussion. So, I'm looking forward to it.
Good. So, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. Andrei, thanks again for accepting an invitation for an interview. So, let's start with the article. The name of this article is BRICS so attractive for China, you say. So, your study looks at big changes in world trade, especially tied to problems between America and China. Can you explain the key moves in how China trades with others this year? Has China been able to, I don't know, to trade with other countries and other places like Europe or Southeast Asia after US ties weakened?
Chinese trade with the US has long been the largest trade flow in the world. During the first decade of the 21st century, China established as a world factory. As you know, it produced a lot of goods for consumption in the US, in Europe, and in many other countries. But after Donald Trump has introduced the new tariffs in April this year, many international organizations such as WTO, IMF, or the World Bank started to adapt their forecasts of global trade to this new information. And so they started to expect a sharp slowdown in global trade from 3% per year to 1 or 1.5%. But the reality turned to be much more interesting because now, with the new data at hand, it's obvious that world trade in 2025 would be stronger than ever. In the beginning of December, OECD forecasted 4.2% global growth of global trade in 2025. And this is exactly the figure of actual growth for the period from January to October, comparing to the previous year. But notably and most interesting for our discussion, China's export growth accounted for 8.7%, and you have heard it right, 8.7% for the period from January to October. And excluding China, global trade growth lowers from 4.2 to 3.3%. And I can name about maybe three possible explanations of strong China's exports in 2025. The first and most obvious is additional demand by US by US buyers. because economic agents expected the tariffs to rise in April, maybe once and for all. And in the first quarter, the dynamics of global trade was very, very strong. And then Trump has postponed and postponed and postponed the implementation of the new tariffs several times, and ultimately until August. And so importers had many chances to accumulate excess inventories. The second explanation surprisingly links strong China's exports with weak domestic demand in China. This version is promoted. What was promoted recently by European economists in its economic bulletin in November. The European Central Bank shows that China's exports grew much faster in sectors with underperforming domestic demand. And the most striking example is steel. We all know that Chinese construction has dropped, and that's why steel exports by China has surged much in recent years. And according to my calculations, based on UN Comtrade data, the share of China in global steel exports was about 5% in 2021, and it surged to 30% in 2022.
30,
Yeah, so
30.
30, yeah. So for today's China, it's quite easy to flood the world market with a product that suddenly suffers from a drop in domestic demand because due to exceptional scale economies in China, that is low cost per one unit of product. And the third explanation of strong China's exports, in my view, is related to trade redirecting and trade rerouting. And here, by redirecting, I mean selling at the new markets, and by rerouting, I mean selling at the same market as before, for example, in the US, at the US market, but through intermediary countries, for example, such as Vietnam or Mexico. And it's important to note that China has made efforts to both redirect its trade and reroute its trade. But for today's discussion, maybe it's also important to note that BRICS countries has not contributed to this process. In other words, China has not found it useful, at least yet, to significantly increase exports to other BRICS countries.
I see. Ben, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think there are, I'd say, two really important points to discussing how the trade patterns have changed with China over the course of since 2022 in particular. You mentioned about Trump's obviously, withholding these or delaying these tariffs. And a really good explanation for this is you can watch the stock market for these certain days where he makes these tariff announcements, and the S&P 500 will drop 3 to 4% because a lot of American investors and consumers, like Andre has already pointed out, are increasingly demanding Chinese related products. And even as the United States tries to reshore or do whatever it can to disrupt trade between them, China's been able to reroute them to countries like ASEAN and Europe. And you made a very interesting point about how European exports to Europe have increased over this time, which I found very interesting. And I guess I was curious about your comment, or I guess what your thoughts about how this will change in the future because of the Europeans' relationship with the United States, as well as them also having tariffs increased on Chinese electric vehicles. So, do you think Europe is a stopgap for a lot of this trade movement, or do you think it'll actually be successful, robust growth?
Okay, I think that Europe for China is now an important market because US raised its tariffs much more than Europe, and Europe now raises tariffs more for some certain product groups, yeah, and while US has raised the overall tariff barrier. So I think that China may, in some sort, reorient a bit to the European market, but in the long term, of course, European market is not growing as fast as the markets of developing countries, and I think that in the long term, China would focus on the developing markets primarily.
Developing markets. Thank you. Andrei, let's come back to your research and the presentation you made at the conference. When we are talking about BRICS, your research shows how China uses BRICS now. So, why has this group become more important for getting raw materials from Russia, from Brazil, instead of being a key place to sell Chinese goods? Why?
Yeah, since 2022, BRICS has considerably raised its importance for China as a supplier of resources and only marginally as a destination market. And in my view, there is a clear economic reason for this fact, for the fact that BRICS is not so attractive for China as a destination market. And in my opinion, the primary reason is quite low average per capita income in BRICS countries. The gap across BRICS countries in per capita income is also highly pronounced. This bloc unites countries with very different per capita income. Such countries as United Arab Emirates and Russia with high per capita income, low income countries such as Ethiopia, and lower middle income countries such as India and Egypt, and so on. And since China attempts to establish its leadership in sophisticated products, in high technology goods, it is more motivated nowadays to direct its exports to developed countries, or at least to rapidly developing regions, such as countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations bloc, ASEAN. Yeah, that's why, despite the trade wars, today U.S. as a big and rich market is still the natural partner for China. And at the same time, I'd like to mention that the scale of production in China is exceptional. It's maybe hard to imagine, but China produces more than a half of world output of such goods, for example, as containers, tableware, kitchenware, and so on. So for China, it may be in some markets, for some goods, it may be impossible to focus its exports on few geopolitically close countries, and it should also export to developed countries as well. For this reason, China should naturally prefer markets that are both large and deep. By deepness, I mean that many buyers have a high having high purchasing power.
I see.
But
So,
yeah, but this
so,
doesn't mean that BRICS is not
so
important.
sorry for interrupting. Just in simple words, for China is interested in big and rich market, and
Yeah,
not
yeah.
interested in poor market. In
Yeah,
simple
I would
words,
say
because
primarily interested, because BRICS is not it is it doesn't mean that BRICS is not important as a destination market at all. Certainly, China is interested in selling some goods at the widest possible range of markets, but BRICS countries doesn't have a unique characteristics in this regard. They have low deepness in this sense. On the other hand, BRICS countries are, as I mentioned, important suppliers of resources in China, especially such countries as Russia, Indonesia, Brazil. And I would like to mention an example of Brazil. For example, Brazil's exports to China in the beginning of the 21st century was 12 times lower than to the USA. And today it is already three times higher. And the main products supplied to China by Brazil are iron ores and some foodstuffs such as soybeans, beef, corn, sugar, and so on. So China is an important market for other BRICS countries.
Brazil now exports to China three times more than it does to the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I see. Ben, Do you see Brazilian goods in the United States?
Maybe
Not
coffee.
Or
nearly.
they are all gone to China?
We've lost a lot of we've lost of actually a lot of Brazilian related products ever since Trump's escalation of tariffs in our air in with Brazil. So much so that they've actually decided to import. Trump decided to import Argentinian beef and beef related products to drive down beef prices, which is just goes to show why Trump's tariff strategy has completely backfired, not just on him but also the United States economy for the not too distant future. But shifting back to China, I'm curious because like you're saying about you know about how China has been, how their development with BRICS partners has sort of developed over time. Within these countries, is China trying to take a lead on any specific sector or industry, or does it sort of depend on the trading partner?
I think that China seeks to gain leadership in high value added products such as electric vehicles, accumulators, solar panels, and so on. And in my view, there are several reasons. There is a purely economical reason because in China the standards of living are rising, and this raises the costs of labor. So China have to reorient to more value-added products, and there is also a geopolitical reason because China have to gain technological sovereignty, and it should produce its own chips, high tech chips. As you know, chips now is like the new oil. Yeah, so I think China also may further increase its foreign direct investment in neighboring countries, including BRICS countries, to move some assembly production, for example, smartphone productions there, for example, in Vietnam or some other geographically close countries.
Thank you. But if again we are talking about that money stuff, you say that BRICS market is not a major export market because for China because people simply earns not enough money, do not earn much money. But how does this affect China's plan to lead in high tech products? Who will buy them? And what problems do BRICS economies create for China's goal to sell advanced products? So simply,
Uh,
who will buy?
Okay, maybe I would not say that BRICS economies create big problems for China because China can redirect its products to other markets, as we see with the case of the US. Rather, it is the problem of BRICS countries themselves because they cannot provide large and stable demand on high tech products. So, for example, in South Africa, this country suffers a permanent electricity crisis from 2007 or 2008, while the access to electricity is naturally very important for using gadgets and other high tech products. And another example is Russia, with its high uncertainty of economic conditions, especially after 2022. We have seen in 2023 and 2024 that China quickly expanded its exports of such goods as cars, bulldozers, and some others to Russia when the market was rapidly growing. But then the Russian market for these goods started to decline due to market saturation, high inventories, due to decline in construction projects, and so on. So this uncertainty is very important in this context. And in fact, I would like also to mention that the market of BRICS countries is in fact very close in size with the domestic market of China. So China's share in global GDP is almost 20%, and the share of other BRICS countries is also almost 20%. So combined, they account for 40% of global GDP. This is a pretty big figure, and so and if to account to the future growth, it would be a more and more important market.
And by more and more important markets, you mean ASEAN countries. So the export, as China's export strategy, in your opinion, where they will send all that goods that they are producing? If Russia's economy is in turbulence, Brazil is not high demand. Other BRICS countries, okay, they have we may say a low income population. The United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. So who?
Okay, I think that ASEAN countries are in the close future are maybe most important for China to find the destination markets for their goods. Such countries as Vietnam, Malaysia, maybe they are fast-growing countries. But also in BRICS, there are countries that are rapidly growing, and I would primarily mention India, that grows very fast, and the population of this country is still growing. So China may find its markets in BRICS also. But I would like also to say that today trade rerouting is more attractive for China maybe than trade redirecting because China now orients on developed markets, and some developing countries are not so deep, as I said before, and they also are often more highly protected from imports. But in the future, we see the tendencies of developed markets to increase the barriers to imports also. The general barriers as in the US, and imports from China in particular, as the EU. So developed countries are also not growing fast, as we all know, and they are not projected to grow fast in the future due to their saturated markets. So, as a consequence, their share in the world economy and in the world demand for imports would gradually reduce. So, the balance of power, in my opinion, would shift to rapidly growing developing countries.
Like Indonesia, India.
Yeah,
So that's
Indonesia,
highly,
India, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on.
very densely populated countries with highest level of young people. Also,
Yeah,
you think?
this is also important, and maybe some countries in Africa now it is hard to make a judgment about African countries. They are not so stable as countries from other regions, but such countries as Nigeria, for example, is very fast growing in population at least.
Yeah,
So China also sees these trends and tries to invest in such countries, to invest in infrastructure, and to make their future with these countries, their mutual trade, mutual investment projects, and so on.
yeah. China is trying to diversify their activities. Yeah, trying to reach new markets. Ben, are you here?
I think so. I think
Oh,
so.
Yeah.
great.
I'm s-
Okay.
I'm dealing with stuff on the fritz, so I apologize if I'm running into any further issues about this. But just to get back to what you were mentioning about China, China focusing on countries like you said in the ASEAN region, it seems like it's a much more localization strategy or regionalization strategy with the ASEAN partners because of the proximity that they are to China, but also because they are in demand of high tech products and things of that nature. Um, but as you were mentioning about the developing economies, I'm curious about what you thought how China has been able to deal with the tariffs that Trump has threatened, added, installed, and removed, and see how China has adjusted it since then.
Okay, I think that tariffs were triggers for several processes, and maybe even the first tariffs in 2019 where the first trigger, the first process is that China became to give more attention to technological sovereignty, having in mind that critical imports may be interrupted. So it has raised its investment in this sector. And the second trigger, this triggered China to reroute trade through some partner countries, and this also was not was not a fast process. So China had to increase its outward foreign direct investments in such countries to make them much more intensive. In simple words, to make some goods produced in Vietnam but owned by Chinese companies.
That's very, very interesting considering how they've been able to not just absorb but reorient the tariffs, as you were saying. And do you think how they've dealt with American tariffs will sort of guide them to dealing with strategies in developing countries too? Because developing countries, as we know, are a lot more likely to have tariffs on goods that they want themselves to become sufficient in.
Yeah, you're right, and maybe especially India is known to have high import tariffs, and we mentioned that India is one of the important future markets for China, and maybe this is some sort of a problem that Chinese economists and politicians should resolve in future. But in my mind, it's also important to not forget about the domestic market, because China's domestic market is may also grow fast in future. It try to reorient its strategy from export driven to domestic market driven strategy. Maybe in these years after the tariffs, it's not so successful, and we see that China's export even growth faster than ever, yeah, this year. But in future, Chinese politicians uh, would wish to reorient on their domestic markets, and so to maybe to increase some imports from developing economies, because a partnership of China with BRICS should also mean that other countries should be also interested in China. Not China should be interested in BRICS only, yeah, and they should be interested to selling their goods on Chinese market.
I see. So, in conclusion, let me say, um, how do you think, Andrei? How do you think both China and BRICS itself will transform the global trade architecture?
Okay, as I mentioned to date, BRICS, including China, accounts for about 40% of global GDP, and this share is gradually rising. The role of BRICS as producers and also as consumers is expected to grow. And it's important to note that BRICS has recently started to expand and has included new countries such as Indonesia from ASEAN. And in my view, BRICS in few years may include a couple of other ASEAN countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia, and this will speed up the intra-BRICS trade and as a whole the South-South trade. That is an important alternative to trading with developed countries.
Ben, do you have something to add about that global architecture, your view?
I mean, I agree with Andre completely on where the world is going. BRICS is becoming more and more BRICS in terms of trade and GDP is becoming more and more the majority than what we've seen in the previous unipolar era. So the more countries join, it is, I'm going to call my Siberia outside. It's a snowball effect. You know,
Oh, we should send him a shovel.
Okay. Anyway, as I was trying to explain before with my demonstration of the snow outside here with the Siberian snowball effect here. Yeah, it, the more and more countries that join BRICS, the bigger the majority it is, the more intra-BRICS trade will happen, and the more development we're going to see across all of these different countries. What's important that Andrey has pointed out here is there is a need for Chinese exports outside, and a lot of countries are in demand for them. But it's also should be real. It will also become more and more of a balanced relationship where Chinese domestic demand are going to rely and want more of the imports that are specialized in countries like BRICS that they can learn and really take full advantage of. So all this will do as the trade architecture expands, there will be a lot more diversity in the imports and the products specializing across all of these different countries. And the more knowledge sharing and cooperation that will increase the innovation and the integration of these technologies that much faster. As more and more countries join, we're going to see this way down the line and it's going to be coming faster and faster and faster.
I see. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for your discussion, for the discussion. Ben, thank you. We appreciate.
Maybe I'll make it out of the snow. Maybe I won't. Who knows?
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Well,
Andreas.
send us pictures, Ben, of yours in the middle of the snow. But I wish I could send you a shovel, but I cannot.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna need more than a shovel right now to get out of here.
Good. Well, Andrei, thank you so much. It was a very good discussion. One more time, I repeat myself. And we wish to see you on our channel again to broader discussion on the economy in general, on BRICS, on China, on ASEAN, and anything you would like to share with our audience, with us also.
Yeah,
Welcome.
great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. And for our viewers, dear friends, here at Think BRICS, we do our best to bring you what official media outlets won't do. So we bring you open discussion. We bring you new voices to express their opinion. We bring you truthful information. Stay with us. Subscribe to Think BRICS, and thanks for watching.